The Arizona sun hung like a copper coin against the darkening sky when Jacob Henley first saw the woman stumbling across his rangeland. 30 years of working this harsh stretch of desert had taught him to read the signs, the way a person moved, the desperation in their gait, the look of someone running from more than just the heat. Jacob had built his life on routine. Every morning, he checked his cattle near Devil's Creek. Every afternoon, he mended fence or repaired whatever the wind had broken overnight. Every evening, he sat on his porch with coffee grown cold, watching the sun die behind the distant mountains. It was a lonely existence, but it was honest work, and after losing his wife Martha to fever 3 winters back, honest work was about all he had left. But this evening was different. This evening brought Sarah Dodd. She appeared first as a wavering figure in the heat shimmer, her sun-bleached dress clinging to her thin frame like a burial shroud. As she drew closer, Jacob could see the fresh blood dotting the fabric near her shoulder, dark stains that spoke of recent violence. Her auburn hair hung wild and tangled, whipped by the desert wind, and her green eyes held secrets darker than the storm clouds. Gathering on the horizon, most striking of all was the leather satchel she clutched against her chest like it contained her very soul. Whatever was in that bag, she'd rather die than lose it. "Mom," Jacob called out, rising from his porch chair. "You look like you could use some water." She froze at the sound of his voice, every muscle tensing like a cornered animal. Behind her, far in the distance, dust clouds rose against the dying light riders moving fast, moving with purpose. "I don't know you," she whispered, backing toward his porch steps despite her obvious exhaustion. "I don't know anyone anymore." Jacob had seen plenty of desperate souls wander onto his land over the years. Prospectors who'd lost everything to fool's gold. Homesteaders driven off their claims by drought or Apache raids. But none like this young woman, barely 20, who looked like she'd stared death in the face and somehow lived to run from it. His weathered hands found his rifle, leaning against the porch rail where he always kept it. 30 years in this godforsaken corner of Arizona had taught him to read danger like scripture. And everything about this moment screamed trouble. "Name's Jacob," he said, keeping his voice steady despite the ice forming in his gut. "And those men following you ain't coming for Sunday dinner." She glanced back at the approaching dust, then at him. Her trembling intensified, and when she spoke, her voice cracked like dry timber. "They killed my father. They killed everyone in Broken Creek." The words came out in a rush, as if holding them back any longer would poison her. "I'm the only one who knows what they did." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and something else, smoke. Old smoke, the kind that clings to clothes and hair long after the flames die. Jacob's jaw tightened. Broken Creek was 2 days' hard ride south, a small mining settlement that had struggled but survived for nearly a decade. If it was gone, truly gone, then these weren't ordinary outlaws chasing this woman. Lightning flickered in the distance, illuminating the riders. 6 of them, maybe 7, their horses lathered with foam from hard travel. They'd been riding with purpose, the kind of men who left no witnesses and told no tales, thought the smart thing would be to send her on her way. Jacob had worked too hard building this ranch to risk it for a stranger's troubles. But something in her eyes, the same haunted recognition that had lived in Martha's face during her final fever dreams, made his decision for him. "Mom," he said, stepping aside and gesturing toward his cabin door. "I don't know what you're carrying in that bag, and I don't much care. But if you want to live to see tomorrow, you best decide right now whether you trust a stranger more than you fear what's coming." She looked at the satchel, then at his face. Whatever she saw there may be the same loneliness that called to her own desperate isolation made her run up the steps and through the door just as the first drops of rain began to fall. Jacob followed, barring the door behind them with hands that had grown steadier with purpose. Through the window, the riders were closer now, close enough to see the glint of steel and the hard set of their faces. Whatever this woman was running from had just found her, and Jacob Henley, who'd wanted nothing more than to live out his days in peaceful solitude, was about to learn that sometimes peace comes with a price that must be paid in blood. Part 2. The weight of truth. What's in the bag? Jacob asked, lighting an oil lamp as darkness swallowed his cabin whole. The warm glow pushed back the shadows, but couldn't touch the cold fear that had settled between them like an unwelcome guest. The woman she still hadn't given her name sat hunched in his wooden chair, the satchel pressed against her like armor. Rain drummed against the roof now, but it couldn't wash away the smell of smoke that clung to her clothes, the acrid reminder of whatever hell she'd escaped. "Evidence," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Letters, documents, proof of what they did to my town." Jacob poured coffee from the pot on his stove, the bitter smell mixing with the tension in the air. His hands moved automatically through the familiar motions, but his mind was racing. Broken Creek had been a hard-scrabble place, sure, but it had been a community. Families, children, good people trying to carve out honest lives from an unforgiving land. "What kind of proof?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her. She opened the satchel with shaking hands, revealing a stack of papers covered in official seals and signatures. Even in the lamplight, Jacob could see the quality of the paper, the weight of authority behind each document. This wasn't some collection of hastily scrawled accusations. This was real. "The railroad company," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "They wanted our land for the new line, but the town council voted no. We had mineral rights, water rights, claims that went back 15 years. So they hired those men to make sure there wouldn't be anyone left to object." Jacob's blood ran cold. He'd heard rumors of such things, entire communities disappearing overnight, their deaths blamed on Apache raids or cholera outbreaks. But seeing the proof, the cold calculation written in corporate letterhead, made his stomach turn. "How many?" he asked quietly. 43 souls. Tears carved tracks down her dust-covered cheeks, and suddenly she looked even younger than her 20 years. "They came at dawn, shot anyone who tried to run, burned the rest alive in the church." She clutched a particular document, her knuckles white against the paper. "I only escaped because I was in the hills collecting herbs for my father's medicine. When I came back, Her voice broke completely then, and Jacob found himself reaching across the table to steady her trembling hands. Through the window, he could see torches moving in the distance. The riders had stopped, probably making camp, waiting for daylight to search properly. They knew she was close, and they had all the time in the world. "Why bring it here?" Jacob asked. "Why not ride for the territorial capital? Get these documents to the governor?" Her laugh was bitter as desert sand. "Because the governor's signature is on half these papers. The railroad owns them, all judges, marshals, politicians. There's nowhere to run where their money can't reach." Jacob stared at the documents spread across his table, understanding the weight of what she carried. This wasn't just evidence of murder. It was proof of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. Anyone who tried to expose it would be signing their own death warrant. "So what's your plan?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. She looked up at him, and for the first time since she'd appeared on his land, her green eyes blazed with something other than fear. "There's a newspaper man in Denver, Thomas Mackenzie. He's been investigating the railroad for months, asking questions they don't want answered. If I can get these documents to him, that's 8 days hard riding through Apache country," Jacob interrupted. "And those men out there know every trail between here and Colorado. Then I'll die trying," she said simply. "My father died believing someone would tell the truth about what happened. I won't let that die with him." Outside, thunder rolled across the desert, and Jacob walked to his window. 6 armed men against one aging rancher and a terrified young woman. The smart play was obvious: hand her over, claim whatever reward money they were offering, and forget this conversation ever happened. But then he thought about Broken Creek, about 43 people who trusted in justice and died for it. He thought about Martha, who'd always said that a man's true character was revealed not in his moments of comfort, but in his choice between safety and doing what was right. In the darkness beyond his window, a horse whinnied, closer than before. The hunters were growing restless, and dawn was still hours away. Jacob turned back to the woman, this guardian of truth who'd stumbled into his quiet life like a messenger from God himself. "What's your name?" he asked Dot. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving streaks of dust and tears. "Sarah," she said. "Sarah Manifest." The irony of the surname wasn't lost on him. Manifest, to reveal, to make clear, to bring into the light. Perhaps there were no accidents in this harsh country, only the hand of Providence working through broken people toward an uncertain justice. "Well, Miss Manifest," Jacob said, checking his rifle and counting his ammunition, "I reckon we better figure out how to keep you alive long enough to make your father proud." Part 3. Dawn's Deadly. Promised. The first shot shattered Jacob's kitchen window at dawn, spraying glass across the floor like deadly snow. Sarah dove behind his overturned table, clutching the leather satchel to her chest while Jacob grabbed his Winchester and extra ammunition from the wooden box beside his fireplace. "Miss Manifest," a voice called from outside, smooth as snake oil and twice as poisonous. "We know you're in there. Send out the lady and the bag, and we'll let the rancher live." Jacob peered through a gap in his shutters. 7 men had his cabin surrounded, their rifles trained on every door and window with military precision. Their leader sat easy in his saddle, a tall man in a black duster decorated with silver concos that caught the early morning light like coins on a dead man's eyes. "That's Wade Brennan," Sarah whispered, her voice tight with fear and recognition. "The railroad's main enforcer. He's the one who gave the orders in Broken Creek." Brennan's voice carried clearly in the still morning air, each word deliberate and final. "You've got 1 minute to decide, rancher. The lady dies either way, but cooperate, and we might let you walk away from this." Jacob checked his rifle. 30 rounds in the box, maybe 40 if he rationed his shots carefully. Against 7 professional killers, it wasn't nearly enough. But Sarah was right about one thing. If these documents died with her, 43 murders would go unpunished, and countless other towns would follow Broken Creek into unmarked graves. "There's a root cellar," Jacob whispered, nodding toward a trap door hidden beneath his kitchen rug. "Tunnel leads to the barn. You might could make it to my horse." "No," Sarah said firmly, surprising him with the steel in her voice. "I won't run anymore. If we're going to die, let's die fighting." Another shot punched through his front door, splintering the wood and sending fragments flying across the room. Brennan's patience was running thin, and his men were growing restless for blood. "Time's up, rancher." Jacob rose from cover and fired, his bullet catching one of Brennan's men in the shoulder. The man screamed and toppled from his horse as the others opened up, filling the cabin with lead and splinters. Wood exploded around them like a storm of razors. Sarah grabbed Jacob's old Colt .45 from the mantelpiece, checking the cylinder with practiced hands that belied her youth. "My father taught me to shoot," she said, answering his surprised look. Said a woman on the frontier needed to know how to defend herself. They fought like demons trapped in hell, trading shot for shot with men who killed for money and slept soundly afterward. Jacob's coffee pot exploded in a shower of tin and steam. His family Bible, the one his mother had carried west in a covered wagon, disintegrated in a hail of bullets. But for every shot they fired, Brennan's men answered with 10. The cabin walls looked like Swiss cheese. Sunlight leaked through bullet holes like golden blood. And Jacob's ammunition was running dangerously low. "The barn's on fire," Sarah said. pointing through the back window where smoke billowed from the structure where Jacob's horse was trapped. Their only escape route was going up in flames, cutting off any hope of flight. Brennan's laughter echoed across the yard, cold and triumphant. No place left to run, folks. Come on now, or we'll burn you out like we did those church mice in Broken Creek. Jacob looked at Sarah, saw his own grim determination reflected in her green eyes. They were down to their last few bullets, trapped in a cabin that was more holes than walls, with nowhere to go and no help coming. Outside, Brennan was reloading his rifle, taking his time now that victory was certain. But then Sarah noticed something that changed everything. "Look," she whispered, pointing through a bullet hole in the wall. Jacob squinted through the gap and felt his breath catch. There, carved into the silver concos on Brennan's duster, was a symbol he could barely make out in the morning light, a distinctive railroad company insignia, but modified with an additional mark. "That's my father's work," Sarah breathed, her voice filled with a mixture of recognition and horror. He was the town silversmith. Brennan came to him months ago, wanted those concos repaired. Father always marked his work with a tiny cross, said every piece of beauty deserved God's blessing. The full weight of betrayal crashed over them both. Sarah's father had unknowingly crafted decorations for the man who would order his death. The people of Broken Creek had trusted Brennan, believed his stories about protecting them from Apache raids, never knowing they were welcoming their own executioner. "He made us accomplices in our own destruction," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "They didn't just murder us, they made us help." Jacob's mind raced. 7 men, 2 bullets left in his Winchester, and Sarah had maybe 3 shots remaining in the Colt. But something about those silver concos, about the cruel irony of Sarah's father blessing the instruments of his own doom, sparked a desperate idea. "That tunnel to the barn," Jacob said quietly. "It doesn't just go to the barn. It connects to an old mine shaft my brother dug before the consumption took him. Comes up near the creek about 200 yards north." Sarah's eyes widened. "We could both escape?" "One of us could," Jacob corrected. "But only if the other keeps them busy long enough to make it through the tunnel and reach the creek." They stared at each other, both understanding what he wasn't saying. Someone had to stay behind. Someone had to die so the truth could live. Sarah started to speak, but Jacob held up his hand. From outside came a new sound, hoofbeats, but different from the ones they'd been hearing. These were coming from the east, moving fast, riders approaching. One of Brennan's men shouted. Jacob risked a look through his front window and felt his heart jump. 3 men wearing territorial marshal badges were cresting the hill, their horses lathered with sweat from hard travel. Real lawmen, not railroad-bought thugs. But Brennan saw them too, and his face went hard as winter stone. "Kill the witnesses," he barked to his men. "All of them. Make it look like a range war gone bad." The game had changed again. Now it wasn't just about Sarah's life or the documents she carried. It was about whether justice had any chance at all in this godforsaken territory, or whether corruption would bury truth along with everyone who dared to speak it. Part 4. The price of justice. The territorial marshals never stood a chance. Brennan's men cut them down in a crossfire that echoed across the desert like thunder, their badges glinting uselessly in the morning sun as they fell from their saddles. 3 good men, dead before they could even draw their weapons, murdered for the simple crime of arriving at the wrong place at the wrong time. But their sacrifice gave Jacob the distraction he needed. As Brennan's attention focused on the new threat, Jacob kicked open his back door and charged into the yard, Winchester blazing. His first shot dropped the man guarding the rear of the cabin. His second shattered another's leg, sending him screaming to the ground. By the time Brennan's remaining men realized what was happening, Jacob was already diving behind his water trough, drawing their fire away from the cabin and away from Sarah. Bullets chewed the wooden trough to splinters, But those precious seconds were all Sarah needed. The rancher. Brennan roared. "Kill him now." Through the chaos of gunfire and shouting, Jacob saw Sarah sprint from the cabin toward the concealed tunnel entrance. The leather satchel was secured across her shoulder. 43 souls worth of justice clutched against her wounded body as she ran for the only chance any of them had left. She almost made it. Brennan's rifle cracked and Sarah stumbled, blood blooming across her other shoulder like a crimson flower. But she didn't fall. Instead, she spun and fired the Colt with her good arm, her bullet punching through Brennan's hat and making him dive for cover. "The tunnel!" Jacob shouted, emptying his last rounds to keep Brennan's head down. "Don't stop running." Sarah reached the hidden entrance and vanished underground just as Jacob's ammunition ran out. For a moment, the desert fell silent except for the crackle of flames from the burning barn and the moans of wounded men. Brennan rose from cover, his face twisted with rage and something that might have been fear. For the first time since this nightmare began, the railroad's enforcer looked like a man who understood he might actually lose. "Search every inch of this place," he commanded his surviving men. "Find that tunnel. Find her." But it was too late. By the time Brennan's men located the mine shaft entrance, Sarah was already emerging near the creek 200 yards away. Jacob watched through the smoke as she caught one of the dead marshals, horses a strong bay that had survived the ambush, and pulled herself into the saddle despite her wounded shoulders. Brennan saw her too. He raised his rifle, drew careful aim across the distance, and fired. The bullet went wide, kicking up dust near the horse's hooves as Sarah spurred the animal toward the northern hills. Sarah manifest rode hard for the horizon, the satchel secured in her saddlebags, carrying the truth about Broken Creek toward whatever justice might still exist in the world. She looked back once, her green eyes meeting Jacob's across the smoke and carnage, and he saw in them a promise that the dead would not be forgotten. Jacob smiled grimly and stepped out from behind the ruined water trough, his hands raised in surrender. Brennan's remaining men, only 3 now, surrounded him with their guns drawn. The odds had shifted, but not enough. "Where's she heading?" Brennan demanded, his silver concos catching the morning light. Those beautiful decorations crafted by Sarah's loving father now seemed like mockery, blessing and curse intertwined. Jacob looked at those concos, thought about the 43 souls of Broken Creek, and felt something like peace settle over him. He'd lived 30 years in this harsh country, had buried his beloved Martha in its unforgiving soil, had carved out a life of honest work and simple dignity. If this was how his story ended, at least it would end with meaning. "Reckon that's between her and God now," he said, quietly. Brennan's face went purple with fury. The railroad's enforcer had built his reputation on fear, on the certainty that money and violence could crush any resistance. But here stood one stubborn rancher who refused to break, refused to betray the young woman who carried justice in a leather satchel. Brennan raised his pistol, finger tightening on the trigger. "Any last words, old man?" Jacob thought of Martha, of the marshals who died trying to do their duty, of Sarah's father crafting beauty with his own hands while unknowingly blessing the instruments of his doom. He thought of all the small acts of courage that kept civilization alive in this brutal place, and knew that his death would be one more thread in that tapestry. "Tell me something, Brennan," Jacob said, his voice steady as bedrock. "When you look at those pretty concos in the mirror each morning, do you see the cross that good man carved into them? Do you remember that he trusted you?" For just a moment, something flickered in Brennan's eyes, not quite conscience, but perhaps the memory of what conscience felt like. Then his face hardened again, and Jacob knew the moment for mercy had passed. The shot, when it came, echoed across the desert like judgment itself. That in the northern hills, Sarah Manifest rode on, wounded but alive, carrying truth toward a reckoning that would shake the territorial government to its foundations. Behind her, smoke rose from Jacob Henley's ranch like a prayer ascending to heaven, bearing the souls of all who died so that justice might live. The railroad had won this battle, but the war for truth was just beginning. Part 5. The Long Road to Justice. 8 days after Jacob Henley died, defending a stranger's truth, Sarah Manifest rode into Denver with fever burning through her veins and determination keeping her upright in the saddle. The bullet wounds in her shoulders had gone bad during the hard journey north, but she'd pressed on through Apache country and mountain passes, sustained by the memory of 43 voices that would never speak again. Thomas Mackenzie's newspaper office sat on Blake Street, squeezed between a saloon and a dry goods store, like truth, hidden between vice and commerce. Sarah nearly fell from her horse when she finally reached the hitching post, her legs barely able to support her weight. After days of riding through pain that would have felled most men, the editor himself answered her knock-a-thin man with ink-stained fingers and eyes that had seen enough corruption to recognize it on sight. When Sarah collapsed on his threshold, clutching the leather satchel that had cost so many lives, Mackenzie didn't ask questions. He simply helped her inside and sent his assistant for the doctor. "I need to tell you about Broken Creek," Sarah whispered as the physician worked on her infected wounds. "And the railroad. And a rancher named Jacob Henley who died so I could bring you this." Mackenzie opened the satchel with the reverence of a man handling scripture. As he read through the documents, the signed orders, the payment records, the correspondence between corporate executives and territorial officials, his face grew pale with understanding. "Sweet Jesus," he breathed. "This goes all the way to the governor's office. Higher," Sarah said through gritted teeth as the doctor cleaned her wounds. "The railroad has senators on their payroll, federal judges. This isn't just about one town. It's about whether law means anything west of the Mississippi." For 3 days, while Sarah fought infection and fever in the doctor's care, Mackenzie verified every signature, cross-referenced every name, and built an ironclad case that would shake the territorial government to its foundations. He sent telegrams to honest officials he trusted, contacted federal authorities who couldn't be bought, and prepared to publish the most important story of his career. But the railroad had eyes and ears everywhere. On the 4th day, 2 men in expensive suits arrived at Mackenzie's office with briefcases full of cash and threats carefully couched in legal language. "Mr. Mackenzie," the taller one said, setting a thick envelope on the editor's desk, "we represent certain business interests that would prefer if recent inflammatory materials didn't see publication. We're prepared to be very generous." Mackenzie looked at the envelope and at the men who'd brought it. He thought of Jacob Henley dying to protect Sarah's evidence, of 43 people burned alive in their own church, of all the other towns that might follow if corruption wasn't exposed. "Gentlemen," he said politely, "I'm afraid you've wasted your trip." The shorter man's smile turned cold. "That's unfortunate, Mr. Mackenzie. Accidents happen so frequently in a growing city like Denver. Fires, building collapses, unfortunate encounters with desperate criminals. It would be tragic if anything happened to your sources." But Mackenzie had been preparing for this moment since Sarah first collapsed on his doorstep. The story was already set in type, copies distributed to newspapers in San Francisco, Chicago, and New York. Federal marshals were already riding south with arrest warrants. The truth was loose in the world, and no amount of money or threats could cage it again. "The story runs tomorrow morning," Mackenzie said firmly. "Front page. And if anything happens to Miss Manifest or myself, 20 other newspapers are prepared to pick up where we left off." The men left without another word, but Mackenzie knew they'd be back. He moved Sarah to a safe house that night, guarded by federal deputies who'd arrived on the evening train. The battle for justice was far from over. When the Denver Post hit the streets the next morning, the headline screamed across the front page in letters 2 inches tall: "Massacre at Broken Creek. Railroad conspiracy exposed." Below it, in smaller type, "Exclusive testimony reveals corporate murder of 43 innocent souls." The story ran for 3 full pages, with photographs of the documents Sarah had saved and detailed accounts of the conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government. Mackenzie had crafted it carefully, letting the evidence speak for itself, while Sarah's testimony provided the human voice of tragedy. Within hours, telegraph wires hummed with outrage. Honest officials who'd been kept in the dark demanded investigations. Newspapers across the country picked up the story, each adding their own calls for justice. The railroad's stock price plummeted as investors fled an enterprise built on blood, money. But the real victory came 3 weeks later, when Sarah Manifest walked into a federal courthouse in Denver to testify before a grand jury. Her shoulders had healed, but her voice still carried the weight of 43 lost souls as she told their story to a room full of federal officials who had the power to act. The indictments came down like an avalanche. Wade Brennan, captured trying to flee to Mexico. 7 corporate executives charged with conspiracy to commit murder. The territorial governor forced to resign in disgrace. Federal judges who'd taken railroad money, stripped of their positions and facing prison. Sarah stood on the courthouse steps afterward, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and thinking of Jacob Henley, who died believing that one person's courage could change the world. The leather satchel was gone now. Its contents entered as evidence in the biggest corruption case in territorial history. But the truth that had carried lived on, demanding justice for the dead and protection for the living. "Miss Manifest," Mackenzie said, joining her on the steps. "What will you do now?" Sarah looked west, toward the Arizona territory, where Jacob's grave lay unmarked and her father's workshop stood empty. "I'm going home," she said simply. "There's a town to rebuild, and I reckon the dead deserve to be remembered properly." The camera pulls back as Sarah walks toward her horse, the setting sun casting her shadow long across the courthouse square. Justice had been served, but the real work of healing and remembrance was just beginning. Part 6. The reckoning. 6 months after Sarah Manifest's testimony brought down a territorial government, the trials began in earnest. The federal courthouse in Denver became the center of national attention as prosecutors laid out the full scope of the railroad conspiracy before juries of honest men who'd never imagined such calculated evil could exist in there. Country. Wade Brennan took the stand first, not as a witness, but as a defendant facing charges of mass murder. The silver Concos still decorated his duster evidence now, tagged and cataloged, but the tiny crosses that Sarah's father had carved into them seemed to burn like brands in the courtroom's bright light. "You stand accused of conspiracy to commit murder," the federal prosecutor said, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed courtroom. 43 counts. Men, women, children. How do you plead? Brennan's lawyer, paid for by railroad money that was rapidly drying up, tried to paint his client as a simple employee following orders. But the evidence was overwhelming. Sarah's documents showed payment records, specific instructions, even bonus payments for thorough completion of the Broken Creek job. Sarah herself sat in the front row throughout the trial, her green eyes never leaving Brennan's face. She'd returned to Arizona long enough to bury Jacob Henley properly, a simple wooden cross marking his grave behind his burned cabin. But she'd come back to Denver to see justice done. The dead deserved that much. When Sarah took the witness stand, the courtroom fell silent. She wore a simple black dress, her auburn hair pinned back severely, and when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who'd looked evil in the face and survived. "He came to our town 3 times before the massacre," she testified, pointing directly at Brennan. "Said he was there to protect us from Apache raids." My father repaired those silver concos on his coat, blessed them with his mark, because he believed Mr. Brennan was a good man trying to keep our community safe. The prosecutor held up the duster. The tiny crosses clearly visible on the silver decorations. These crosses were carved by your father? Yes, sir. He said every piece of beauty deserved God's blessing. He never knew he was blessing the instruments of his own death. Brennan's face remained stone throughout Sarah's testimony, but something flickered in his eyes when she described finding the bodies in the church. The careful way the railroad's killers had locked the doors before setting the fire. For just a moment, the mask slipped, and the courtroom saw not a confident enforcer, but a man who understood that his own reckoning had finally come. The testimony took 3 days. Sarah described each victim by name, told their stories, made them real for the jury. Thomas Mackenzie presented the documentary evidence, the paper trail that connected corporate boardrooms to mass murder. Federal marshals testified about finding the burned remains of Broken Creek, the careful staging meant to make it look like an Apache raid. When the prosecution rested, Brennan's lawyer made a desperate play. He called character witnesses, men who swore the defendant was just following orders, that he'd shown mercy in other situations. But it rang hollow against the weight of evidence and the reality of 43 graves. The verdict came back after 2 hours of deliberation. Guilty on all counts. Wade Brennan, the judge said, his voice heavy with the weight of justice. You have been found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder in the deaths of 43 innocent souls. You have betrayed the trust of the communities you were sworn to protect and participated in a conspiracy that strikes at the very heart of our territorial system of government. The judge looked directly at Sarah before continuing. However, this court recognizes that justice is not merely about punishment. It's about remembrance and preventing such horrors from happening again. Therefore, this court sentences you to death by hanging, sentenced to be carried out in 30 days. Sarah felt no satisfaction in the verdict, only a hollow sense that the scales had finally balanced. Brennan would die, but it wouldn't bring back her father or Jacob Henley or any of the 43 souls lost in Broken Creek. The other trials followed quickly. Corporate executives received prison sentences ranging from 20 to 40 years. The former territorial governor was sentenced to life imprisonment for his role in the conspiracy. Federal judges who'd taken railroad money were stripped of their positions and sent to federal prison. But the biggest victory came when Congress passed emergency legislation creating federal oversight of railroad expansion, requiring military protection for frontier communities and establishing harsh penalties for corporate violence. The Broken Creek Massacre, as history would remember it, became the catalyst for genuine reform. On the day of Brennan's execution, Sarah stood among the crowd gathered in the prison yard. She'd come not for revenge, but to bear witness to be the last person. Wade Brennan saw who remembered the names of his victims dot as the noose was placed around his neck. Brennan looked out over the crowd and found Sarah's face. For the first time since she'd known him, his mask fell away completely, and she saw not a monster, but a broken man who'd traded his soul for railroad money and power. Any last words? The Hammond asked. Brennan's eyes never left Sarah's face. Tell them, he said quietly, that I remember their names. All 43 of them. The trap door opened, and justice was done. Sarah turned away as the crowd began to disperse, walking toward the train station where she'd catch the afternoon departure back to Arizona. There was still work to do, a town to rebuild, a memorial to construct, a future to build on a foundation of remembrance. But as she walked through Denver's busy streets, she carried with her the knowledge that the dead had not died in vain. Their sacrifice had exposed a corruption so vast it shook the foundations of territorial government and led to reforms that would protect countless other communities. In the end, truth had proven stronger than money, justice more powerful than conspiracy. It had taken longer than anyone hoped and cost more lives than anyone should have to pay. But the light had finally driven back the darkness. Part 7. The New Dawn 1 year after Wade Brennan's execution. Sarah Manifest stood in the center of what had once been Broken Creek, watching federal surveyors lay out the boundaries for a new town. The old settlement was gone, burned to ash in memory. But from that devastation would rise something better, a community built on truth rather than fear, protected by law rather than vulnerable to corporate greed. The federal government had moved quickly after the trials ended. Compensation flowed to the families of victims. Land grants were awarded to encourage honest settlement, and most importantly, a permanent federal garrison was established nearby to ensure that no community would ever again face the horror that had befallen Broken Creek. Sarah had used her portion of the settlement money wisely. She'd purchased the land where Jacob Henley's ranch had stood and began construction of a school that would bear his name. The Jacob Henley Academy would teach not just reading and arithmetic, but also the importance of standing up for truth, of protecting the innocent, and of understanding that justice sometimes required ordinary people to do extraordinary things. The schoolhouse was nearly finished now, its white walls gleaming in the Arizona sun. Sarah had insisted on using wood from the mountains north of Denver, the same timber that had sheltered her during her desperate flight to justice. Every board carried the memory of that journey, of the price paid for truth, but today brought special visitors that made Sarah's heart swell with pride and hope. Thomas Mackenzie had arrived from Denver, accompanied by a delegation of federal officials and newspaper editors from across the country. They'd come to witness the dedication of the Broken Creek Memorial, a simple granite monument that would ensure the 43 souls lost in the massacre would never be forgotten. Sarah, Mackenzie said, approaching her as she watched the workers put finishing touches on the memorial. "Are you ready for this?" She nodded, though her throat felt tight with emotion. Carved into the granite were all 43 names, including her father's, Samuel Manifest, Silversmith, and father. Below the names, the inscription read, "They died for truth. May their memory guard liberty." As the dedication ceremony began, people arrived from across the territory. Families who'd heard the story and wanted to pay their respects. Federal marshals who'd helped capture the conspirators. Former railroad workers who'd quit in disgust when the truth came out. Even some of the jurors who'd convicted Brennan and his fellow conspirators made the journey to Arizona. The territorial governor, an honest man appointed to replace the corrupt official who'd taken railroad. Money spoke first. His words were simple but powerful. What happened here reminds us that evil succeeds only when good people remain silent. These 43 souls died because they refused to be silent about what was right. When Sarah's turn came to speak, she walked to the podium with steady steps, though her hands trembled slightly as she looked out over the crowd. The faces before her represented something her father and Jacob Henley had died to protect, a community of honest people committed to justice and truth. "My father used to say that every piece of beauty deserved God's blessing," she began, her voice carrying clearly in the desert air. "He carved a tiny cross into every piece he made, believing that his work could bring light into the world. When he blessed Wade Brennan's silver conchos, he didn't know he was blessing the instruments of his own death. But I've come to understand that his blessing remained true, even in that darkness." She paused, looking at the memorial where her father's name was carved in permanent stone. You see, those crosses didn't disappear when Brennan committed his crimes. They remained, bearing witness, waiting for justice. In the courtroom, when the evidence was presented, those tiny crosses spoke louder than any testimony. They reminded everyone that good people had touched even the tools of evil, and that goodness would ultimately prevail. The crowd listened in respectful silence as Sarah continued. Jacob Henley died defending a stranger because he understood something fundamental about life on the frontier. We're all connected by threads of humanity that make us stronger than any corporation, any corrupt official, any man with a gun and evil in his heart. When he chose to protect me, he chose to protect all of us." She gestured toward the new schoolhouse rising in the distance. "This community will be different from the old Broken Creek. It will be built on the foundation of what we learned from that terrible time. That ordinary people have extraordinary power when they stand together for truth. That justice may be delayed, but it cannot be denied. And that memory is our most sacred responsibility." As Sarah concluded her remarks, an unexpected figure stepped forward from the crowd. It was Martha Brennan, Wade's widow, a thin woman in a black dress who traveled from Texas to be present at the ceremony. The crowd murmured in surprise as she approached the podium. "Miss Manifest," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the still air. "I wanted to come here to say something. My husband did terrible things. I can't undo what he did, and I can't bring back the people he killed. But I want you and everyone here to know that some of us who bear his name reject everything he stood for." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. "These were his silver concos, the ones your father blessed. The federal marshals gave them to me after the execution. I want to give them to you for your memorial. Let them serve truth instead of evil." Sarah unwrapped the cloth, revealing the silver concos with their tiny crosses still visible despite everything they'd witnessed. For a moment, she saw her father's workshop, his careful hands blessing these pieces with holy marks, not knowing the journey they would take through darkness toward light. "Thank you," Sarah said, accepting the concos. "These will be displayed in the school, where children can learn that even in our darkest moments, goodness finds a way to survive and eventually triumph." As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Sarah remained beside the memorial, running her fingers over her father's name carved in granite. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded her of another sunset, when she'd first stumbled onto Jacob Henley's ranch with nothing but fear and a leather satchel full of truth. Thomas Mackenzie approached as she stood in quiet contemplation. "What's next for you, Sarah?" She looked toward the new schoolhouse, then at the federal garrison being constructed nearby, then at the surveyed lots where honest families would build honest lives protected by just laws. "I'm going to teach," she said simply. "Teach children about courage, about standing up for what's right, about the price of justice and why it's worth paying. And the silver concos?" Sarah held them up to catch the last rays of sunlight, the tiny crosses gleaming like stars. "They'll remind students that every person has the power to bless the world with their choices, even in the darkest circumstances. That's what my father believed, what Jacob believed, and what I believe." As night fell over the Arizona desert, Sarah walked toward the boarding house where she'd spend the night before beginning her new life as a teacher and keeper of memories. Behind her, the memorial stood as a permanent testament to the truth that ordinary people, armed with courage and commitment to justice, could defeat even the most powerful forces of corruption. The camera pulls back to show the entire scene, the memorial gleaming in the moonlight, the half-built school that would educate future generations, the federal garrison that would protect the innocent, and Sarah Manifest, walking toward tomorrow with her father's blessed silver in her hands and 43 souls watching over her from whatever lies beyond. Sunset. Part 8. Legacy of Light 5. Years had passed since the dedication of the Broken Creek Memorial, and the Jacob Henley Academy had become the pride of the Arizona Territory. Sarah Manifest, now 26, and respected throughout the region as both educator and keeper of historical truth, stood before her latest class of students, 15 boys and girls, ranging in age from 6 to 16, their faces bright with the curiosity that only comes from learning in an atmosphere of safety and trust. The schoolhouse had grown beyond her original vision, Federal funding and private donations had allowed for expansion. A library filled with books donated by sympathetic readers across the country. A workshop where students learned practical skills. And most importantly, a small museum that displayed the artifacts of the Broken Creek Massacre, including Wade Brennan's silver concos with their tiny blessed crosses. "Today we're going to talk about choices," Sarah said, as she did every Friday afternoon. This had become her tradition, ending each week with a lesson about character, about the moments that define who we become. Young Timothy Henderson raised his hand. At 12, he was one of her brightest students, the son of a federal marshal stationed at the nearby garrison. "Miss Manifest, why do you keep those evil man's concos in our school? Shouldn't we throw them away?" Sarah walked to the display case and carefully removed the silver ornaments. Even after all these years, she could see her father's tiny crosses, still visible despite everything they'd witnessed. "That's an excellent question, Timothy. Who else has thoughts about this?" Rebecca Patterson, a serious 14-year-old whose family had moved to the new town from Colorado, spoke up. "I think we keep them to remember what happened, so it doesn't happen again." "That's part of it," Sarah agreed. "But there's something else. Look closely at these crosses my father carved." She held the concos where all the students could see them. "My father blessed these, not knowing they would be worn by a man who committed terrible crimes. Does that make my father's blessing less real? Does evil erase goodness?" The students considered this in the way only children can, with complete seriousness and open hearts. "The blessing stays," said Maria Santos, whose family had arrived from Mexico seeking honest work and fair treatment. "Evil can't take away what good people do." "Exactly right, Maria. These crosses remind us that good people touch everything they encounter, even when they don't know where their work will go. Every kindness you show, every truth you tell, every time you stand up for what's right, those actions ripple outward in ways you may never see." Sarah returned the concos to their display case, next to a photograph of Jacob Henley that a visiting photographer from Denver had taken the year before his death. The old rancher's eyes looked out at the students with the same steady determination he'd shown on the day he chose to protect a stranger carrying dangerous truth. Mr. Henley never got to see the justice that came from his sacrifice, Sarah continued. "He died not knowing whether I would make it to Denver, whether the truth would be believed, whether the corrupt officials would be brought to justice. He acted on faith that doing right was worth the cost, even if he never saw the results." The lesson was interrupted by a knock at the schoolhouse door. Sarah opened it to find a familiar face. Thomas Mackenzie, now editor emeritus of the Denver Post. His hair silver, but his eyes as sharp as ever. "Mr. Mackenzie," Sarah exclaimed, genuine pleasure lighting her face. "Students, this is the newspaper man who helped expose the truth about what happened here." Mackenzie smiled at the eager young faces. "I've brought something special to show you," he said, producing a leather portfolio. "These are letters from children across the country who've read about Broken Creek and your school. They wanted you to know that your story has inspired them to stand up for truth in their own communities." As Mackenzie read, letters from students in New York, California, and Texas children who'd started their own clubs dedicated to fighting injustice and protecting the vulnerable, Sarah felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond personal triumph. The truth that had cost so many lives was now planting seeds of courage in young hearts across the nation. After the students were dismissed for the weekend, Sarah and Mackenzie walked to Jacob's grave behind the school. Someone had left fresh wildflowers there, as they did every week. Sarah suspected it was Maria Santos, whose family had been helped by the federal marshals when local ranchers tried to cheat them out of their wages. "Any regrets?" Mackenzie asked, as they stood beside the simple wooden cross that marked the resting place of a man who died for strangers. Sarah considered the question seriously. The path she'd chosen had been hard, The nightmares still came sometimes. Dreams of fire and gunshots and desperate rides through Apache country. She turned down 3 marriage proposals, choosing instead to dedicate her life to education and remembrance. Some might call it a sacrifice. No regrets, she said finally. Look around you, Thomas. This town exists because people were willing to pay the price for truth. These children are safe because someone stood up to corruption. The federal reforms to protect frontier communities, all of that grew from the seeds planted, in blood and watered with tears. She gestured toward the memorial, where evening visitors often came to read the names and remember. My students will grow up knowing that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. They'll understand that justice isn't something that happens. To you, it's something you make happen through courage and commitment to what's right. As if summoned by her words, a young couple approached the memorial, holding hands and reading the inscription quietly. Sarah recognized them newlyweds who'd moved to the territory because they'd heard. It was a place where honest people could make him, honest living under the protection of just laws. The story isn't finished, is it? Mackenzie observed. Stories like this never finish, Sarah replied. They just keep growing, touching new lives, inspiring new choices. Every time one of my students stands up to a bully, every time someone refuses to be silent about wrongdoing, every time people choose courage over comfort, that's Broken Creek living on. The sun was setting now, painting the desert in the same golden light that had illuminated her desperate flight to Denver 5 years before. But this sunset brought peace instead of terror, hope instead of desperation. As Mackenzie prepared to leave for his hotel, he handed Sarah a file envelope. One more letter, he said. This one's special. Sarah opened it to find elegant handwriting on official congressional stationery. The letter was from the chairman of the House Committee on Territorial Affairs, informing her that Congress was considering legislation to create a federal program supporting schools like hers across the frontier institutions, dedicated to both education and the preservation of historical truth. The Jacob Henley Academy model, the letter read, represents the finest ideals of American frontier education. Your work has demonstrated that communities built on truth and justice are not only possible, but essential for the moral development of our expanding nation. Sarah folded the letter carefully, adding it to the collection of documents that would eventually fill the school's archive. Future students would read these testimonies to the power of ordinary people choosing to do extraordinary things. That night, as she had every night for 5 years, Sarah walked through the school one final time before going to her small apartment above the library. She paused in the museum room, looking at the display case that held the silver concos with their tiny crosses, her father's last blessing, transformed from instruments of evil into symbols of redemption. Thank you, Papa, she whispered, as she did every evening. Thank you, Jacob. Thank you to all 43 souls who paid the price for this moment. Outside her window, the lights of the new town twinkled like earthbound stars. Families were settling down for the night in homes protected by just laws. Children were sleeping safely in their beds, dreaming of futures filled with possibility rather than fear. Federal marshals stood watch over a community that would never again face the terror of corporate violence or government corruption. Sarah Manifest, teacher and keeper of memory, guardian of truth and cultivator of courage, fell asleep with the satisfaction that comes only from a life lived in service to something greater than oneself. In her dreams, she saw not the flames of Broken Creek or the desperate ride through Apache country, but an endless succession of young faces, her students and their children and their children's children, carrying forward the light of truth into whatever darkness the future might hold. The story of Broken Creek had become the story of America itself, a tale of ordinary people finding extraordinary courage, of justice delayed but never denied, of truth surviving every attempt to bury it. And in a small schoolhouse in the Arizona Territory, That story continued to grow. One student at a time, one choice at a time, one generation at a time. The camera pulls back one final time, showing the memorial gleaming in the moonlight, the school standing ready for Monday's lessons, and the peaceful town that rose from ashes to become a beacon of hope for all who believe that right will triumph over might, that truth will outlast deception, and that ordinary people, armed with courage and commitment to justice, can indeed change the world. Fade to black. The end.